The lecture today is Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death and Art by Dr. Rebecca Wragg Sykes. My name's Dominic Wallace. I'm Head of Development for the Society, and I'm responsible for helping develop resources to bring you events like this. So, for example, the equipment you're watching this lecture on, if you're watching it online or here, is raised through funds that we generate through fundraising. I'd like to say a few words about the Society. We were founded in 1707 at a meeting in a pub called the Bear Tavern for the purpose of investigating and debating material remains of the past found in Britain. We were awarded a royal charter by George III in 1751 with the charge of the encouragement, advancement and furtherance of the study and knowledge of the antiquities and history of this and other countries. At the same time, we were given rooms in Somerset House, which we shared with the Royal Society. This allowed us to house and care for a growing library and museum collection and hold meetings for fellows and discuss and debate their research into the material past. We moved here, Burlington House, in 1874, where we continue to focus on fellowship, conservation, research and dissemination of our work. Today, we remain focused on those core objectives, and as a registered charity, we are committed to sharing our collections and our work with the public, which we do through public lectures like this, exhibitions, scholarly research, seminars, and a programme of publications. You may also be aware that we've recently conserved William Morris's Cotswolds home, Kelmscott Manor, and that opens to the public on the 1st of April, and I hope you'll have a chance to go and see it soon. Now, this is our third public lecture of the spring season. We have one more to go. It's a hybrid event, so there will be a Q&A at the end. We'll be taking questions from the room and on Zoom and on YouTube. So if anyone would like to ask a question online, please type in the chat function and Rebecca will ask as many questions as we have time for at the end of the lecture. For those of you in the room, just please raise your hands. Our speaker today is Dr. Rebecca Wragg Sykes. Rebecca is an archaeologist, writer and honorary fellow in the School of Archaeology, Classics and Egyptology at the University of Liverpool. Her writing has featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Eon and elsewhere, and she has appeared on numerous radio programs, podcasts and other media. Her first book, Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death and Art in 2020 is a critically acclaimed bestseller. She's the winner of the Penn Hessel Tiltman Prize for History in 2021 and winner of Current Archaeology Book of the Year 2020. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks to, oh, I'm here. Right, yes, it's wonderful to be here and thank you to everybody who's come in person and people who I can't see online potentially. Hello as well. Yes, and very grateful for the invitation to come and speak today. I was a fellow at one point of the Society, so it's fantastic to be here. I will kind of be giving you a whistle-stop tour of what I hope is our modern, up-to-date understanding of everything one might want to know about Neanderthals, basically. So, yeah, my book, my background is I'm an archaeologist. I'm a specialist in Neanderthal archaeology. My PhD was on the late Neanderthals from this country, of which we don't have a spectacular amount of evidence compared, for example, to France or Germany, but there's still things you can say. And my sort of expertise and training was in stone tool analysis, so lithic analysis. But my interest in Neanderthals is, well, all-consuming, I guess. So the book really is intended to be, yes, a definitive account of what can we say archaeologically about the Neanderthals, who were they? So I will dive in. Okay, so where do we start with Neanderthals? We will go back to the middle of the 19th century, what I would call their rediscovery, because in fact we first discovered them in the Pleistocene 50,000 years ago odd. So this is our rediscovery of the Neanderthals, and the first recognized find was from Germany, a site called the Feldhofer Cave, 1856. However, there had been previous discoveries of Neanderthal remains that were not recognized. So I think I can use the mouse, can I? Yes. So this is the skull from Forbes Quarry in Gibraltar, which was found 1848, but not recognized as anything in particular, perhaps because, as you can see, there's a lot of concretions on this. And in the minutes of the Scientific Society for Gibraltar, it was just noted as skull. So, now we can see actually anatomically it's quite distinctive and odd looking, but it wasn't really noticed. And there was one even earlier from what's now Belgium, which was the top of the skull of a young child and also the upper fragment of an upper jaw. But that probably was also not realized as anything out of the ordinary, because a little bit like our children, Neanderthals sort of grew into their faces. So they look a lot more distinctive as adults. So that's sort of the history. There is like tons of other very interesting historical context to the discovery of Neanderthals, which I can't go into today because I'm going to do the archaeology itself. But that's all in the book as well. So we will fast forward to 2021, 22/now. So where do we place Neanderthals after more than 165 years of studying them? What do we know? Well, one of the things that has clearly dramatically transformed is where they fit in this big picture of human evolution. So Neanderthals are up here, here's us, and we share a common ancestor with them around 550 to 765,000 years ago, which, if you're somebody who's into Roman archaeology, that might sound dreadfully long ago, but on the scale of human evolution, it's not really. So we go back through time, we get to 1 million years here, and the scale changes on this image. So now we're at 2 million, 3 million, 4 million years ago. So we have sort of 15 odd hominin species within our very bushy family tree now, going back to around 4 million years. And so actually the Neanderthal sort of branching from us is very recent. And we should expect not only that physically they would actually be very much like us, which they are, but also behaviorally, they are literally our closest relations. And we also know the most about them out of any of these other different forms of hominin and ancient kinds of human. We have an extremely rich archaeological record for Neanderthals. Again, if you want to compare it to the Romans, yes, we don't have palaces and things like this, but we have thousands of pieces of bones and teeth representing in various states of completeness, probably a couple of hundred actual individual Neanderthals, which is a lot, covering sort of the whole span of their lives from newborns through teenagers, adults, and more older individuals as well. And we have material from across a very wide geographic range and an awful lot of archaeology. And we'll see a bit more of that later. So this is where they fit. And just to give you, again, I won't go into this in this talk, but sort of their broad anatomy, you really, one must put out of one's head nowadays the idea that they were some sort of missing link or, halfway to some very primitive other form of humanity. They really were another kind of human who was really closely related to us. So on the left here, we have a Homo sapiens individual, and here is a Neanderthal. You can see they're perfectly upright. There's not much difference in the height. Yes, on average, they're a bit shorter, There are differences across their bodies. You can see the ribs, for example. Our ribs are much narrower. So Neanderthals didn't have a waist in the way that we do. They're a bit more barrel-chested. Their bones overall are thicker, different proportions in different places. The skull is dramatically different. When you just put them side by side, you can really see the difference. But they still are clearly a derived form of human. They don't look very, very primitive and sort of very chimp-like, unlike some of the sort of 3 million-year-old Australopithecine species. And also the other thing I think that really where we are now in our modern understanding of Neanderthals is that they were hugely physically impressive individuals, massively athletic. The fact they're a little bit shorter, ever biomechanical modeling basically shows that they were just as, or perhaps even more efficient walkers than us, perhaps not so good at long distance running, but certainly great at sprinting and very, very capable and living full hunting and gathering lives. So this is sort of who we're talking about in this talk. And, where are we talking about for Neanderthals? This is a map from the book. So this is not a map of every Neanderthal site. This is simply the main ones I actually talk about. But you can see, they go from Wales, where I live, down into Iberia, across into the Near East, and right across into Central Asia. And so far, the most eastern extent that we have of recognized remains is from Siberia. But that may not be the actual eastward extent of this very large sort of realm of activity. And one other thing to point out is that sort of traditionally, Neanderthals have been framed in a lot of popular accounts as a European species. If you look at the size of this, there's actually more of Asia in this map than there is in Europe. So we must really think of them as a Western Eurasian hominin living across a huge variety of landscapes. And this idea of variety in Neanderthals is really central to sort of contemporary understanding and research about them. And it's something I really wanted to pull out in the book. Again, one of these persistent sort of notions about Neanderthals that has stuck around for a long time and derived a little bit from sort of the 19th century context of many discoveries, which was in sediments which often had Pleistocene animal species which were from colder Pleistocene periods. They then sort of became really heavily associated with ice ages and cold, and that they were, perhaps hyper-Arctic adapted. And that, again, is not really the way that we see them now. So this image here, this is a map of the climate. So Neanderthals emerge around here, sort of 350, maybe just after 400,000 years ago. So that's when we can see them emerging as a visible species. So it's somewhat after that split between our two lineages. And they are around all the way through to here, basically about 40,000 years ago. And these red blocks are the warm periods, as in interglacials like we're living in right now, so not ice ages. So you can see Neanderthals actually were living during a lot of really quite balmy periods. So yes, they absolutely did deal with really cold conditions, but that's not the whole story. And also, if we take just one period here, so this is what we call marine isotope stage 5, which just means where we get that climate data is from sediment cores from under the sea. Stage 5 begins around 130,000 years ago. There's a huge increase to very warm temperatures here, and then it sort of gets colder and colder. But if we zoom in, you can see the level of climate detail that we can get now for this huge span of tens and tens and tens of millennia. And we can examine, what Neanderthals doing during this absolute peak of warm periods. What was their lives then during full forests? And then how did they cope as the climate got really sort of jaggedy and very varied? So this is the sort of the depth of context that we have for them. And yeah, just to sort of really make the point visually, yes, they did live during cold periods, but they didn't really like extreme cold. If you find this species, which is a musk ox, in your archaeological sites, you're less likely to find Neanderthals. Musk oxen are basically very well adapted to extreme cold and especially deep snow. Neanderthals are much more sort of likely to be found in the middle, sort of steppe, tundra, grassland, and also forests. They were people who knew woodlands, forests. Think of the Mesolithic. We imagine them as people of the forest. Neanderthals are just as much that kind of human. And also the geographic range that we're talking about, you know, they're living up to 2,000 meters in some mountainous areas. We know from the studying the movement of the stone tools from source to site that they're crossing high mountain passes, all sorts of different landscapes and topographies, right down to the coast. And, you know, we have to imagine them as foraging around in rock pools because we can see it archaeologically. So this variety is really important. And also something I really wanted to communicate in the book is, you know, just the mind-blowing advances in archaeology as a discipline since the middle of the 19th century. So this here on the left, this is Otto Hauser, one of the early excavators of Neanderthals in 1908, and he's standing in his, not really sure I can call it an excavation, it looks more like a bomb site. This is La Mécoque in France. You know, a lot of the people at the time, not everybody dug as sort of crazily as he did. There were other people who were rather more careful. But, you know, the difference in what we do now, where, you know, 21st century archaeology is all about as much about the sediments that the stuff is in rather than just the objects. You know, we must know about how our sites formed in order to understand where the materials are coming from, what's happened to those materials since they went into that site. And it's so important when we're dealing with deep time, as we are with Neanderthals, because you can, you know, literally scrape away centuries in a couple of trowel movements. So we have to be really, really good at preserving our context and recording. So, you know, now everything is used with total station lasers. We have barcodes. Everything is kept down to tiny little sizes. And obviously we sample the sediments too. And all of that's really important because it means that, you know, we can also add to that other new techniques, for example, 3D refitting of individual blocks of stone where we can see moment by moment the choices made by an individual Neanderthal. And that's really important for understanding cognition. Basically, how are they thinking? We can look over their shoulders. And we can sort of zoom in a little bit to particular sites. And I do this in the book. I kind of try to choose flagship sites really that show not only about Neanderthal life, but also how do we know what we know? And I think unless you work in Pleistocene archaeology or Paleolithic archaeology, it can be quite surprising the detail that we can wring out from the record, even though we don't have rich arrays of objects most of the time. So El Salt in Spain is a really great case study where, for example, you start by excavating a hearth. We have some deer bones here. You look at the spatial stuff, but then also we'll zoom in and we take thin sections of the sediment to try and look at the microhistory of that hearth. What were the different stages of burning? Were there different phases of different temperatures? So was this hearth used in different ways? And then you can zoom in further and, for example, look for bone with different histories of burning on, and then say, okay, material in this area of the cave is probably a mix of ash from different hearths and it's a midden. And from that, we can say, okay, well, there's spatial organization here. They're actually, you know, not just behaving like hyenas and scrabbling around, they have a structure to their daily life. So it's this kind of archaeology that's important. And also, you know, in terms of broad site scale advances in how we do archaeology, Abric Romani is another really fantastic site. If anybody gets to go on holiday to Barcelona, you can visit this site. It's amazing. It's a huge, huge rock shelter, very deep deposits covering tens of millennia of Neanderthal activity. And this is just, again, another flagship site to show the importance of modern methods. So here, as I was saying before, you can sort of be troweling and excavating, and there are micro phases of occupation in those layers that you can't see as you excavate. But later, when you plot out all those 3D coordinates of the objects that you took with your lasers, those layers emerge in your data. So then you can start to pull out different phases of Neanderthal activity within one layer. And the point of that is that you can then compare what they're doing at different times within the same site. So this is layer P from Abercrombie, and you can see PA and PB, different spatial use of this site. Here, they're at the back, most of the activity is there. Here, the core of activity is in a different place, and they're not occupying the back. And, you know, we can then start to unpick, why is that? And what's going on? And again, hearths are so important because they allow us not only to understand Neanderthal activity, but really pick apart this problem of deep time within sites. If you have a site where you've got a spread of, like at Abercrombie, 60 hearths in one site, you can't say for sure that those are all contemporary with each other. You have to try and pick those apart and work out different phases, and that's the kind of work that goes on. And also then you can do refitting analysis, where you put back together the pieces of stone and bone to try and work out what the spatial relationships between different hearths are. Are those really two hearths that were being used at the same time or not? And this has implications for things like group size. You know, how big are the groups that are living in these sites? We assume with hunter-gatherers, as Neanderthals were, that they're going to be quite small. And the archaeology does support that. It looks like they really were living in very small groups most of the time, probably less than 20. And in some cases where we have very high resolution sites, we can even zoom in and make an argument that we can see literally 1 or 2 nights of occupation. So this is another Spanish site, Abric del Pastor, where there's a single hearth that has been picked out using all these methods I've talking about. So they can say, yes, this is one phase. And around this hearth, there were only, I think, maybe 4 or 5 blocks of stone that were taken apart. And there's more animal bones than there is stone. So it really looks as if this is just a handful of people who have arrived, spent the night, hunted a bit, and then gone again. And to be able to see that resolution of Neanderthal activity from 55,000 years ago is quite mind-blowing. It's cool, but it also helps us unpick other things like, well, okay, are the groups small? Did the groups ever split up? And I think in this case, with such a tiny, tiny presence, ephemeral presence, we probably are looking at members of another group that have split off to go and do something. And then they're coming back again, presumably bringing something that they've collected or hunted to others somewhere else. So that's already giving us a really detailed understanding of group dynamics. And it's very rare, but we can do it. So how did Neanderthals live? You know, when we sort of put together all the whizzy stuff that we can do with archaeology now, what is the picture of their lives? So I've talked about the environments that they lived in and the fact they're hunter-gatherers. And I think this is one of the things also that is really exciting and surprising is the picture of Neanderthals that has changed versus the notion that they maybe were not very good hunters. You know, whatever we talk about with Neanderthals, we always historically have come up against the fact that they're not here. And there's been a really clear agenda to find reasons why they were rubbish, basically. Like, what did they do really badly? And can we find evidence for it? And so obviously hunting and the way they made a living has been really key to that. However, if you look over the past century, almost every theory that's put forward about Neanderthals not being very good at X, Y, Z in terms of subsistence just doesn't hold up with new archaeological research. You know, the idea that they were not very good at hunting, can't say that anymore. They clearly were absolutely top hunters in their environment. So this is a 19th century image. I do like it because not only are they running away and looking terrified, but just look at the size of that. It's totally far too gigantic even. But for the drama, it's nice. But we know now that, yes, in some cases, it's very likely that they were actually targeting mammoths, perhaps younger individuals, perhaps in some cases, not going for whole herds, because that would be just unwise. But this is the modern image of what Neanderthals were eating. Basically, anything that was around, they could tackle, they could deal with. In colder environments, they go for big megafauna. So yes, mammoths, woolly rhinos, but they also not only are going for the big stuff like mammoth, but they're also really interested in medium-sized game, because the picture that we kind of see is that they're actually more interested in what's the best return for their energy a lot of the time. And in some places, there's no point hunting huge things if you've got a lot of smaller game around you. So, for example, this is a fallow deer from one of those, from a stage 5 site. Do you remember I was saying there was that warm period about 122,000 years ago? This is a German site. And here we have a really fantastic case where we've literally got the hole that a spear went into, and very nice sort of modeling of the angle that spear had to go in and things like this from this site. So this is a thrust spear, probably. But we also know that they probably did have spears that they threw. So the environment's really important. It's not just big game, it's medium-sized too, but they're selecting. They're really interested in the quality. So sometimes they'll select by species, also by age, so prime age often. But they also go for smaller game. You know, this again was one of those theories that maybe they just were not very good at hunting small things. That really doesn't hold up. We see that they're hunting birds, sometimes taking birds of prey, and they also hunt carnivores. But sometimes there's sort of weird things. This is a butchered leg of a blackbird from a Spanish site, Cova Negra. And, you know, you might think, well, maybe they were just starved and they were literally eating tiny stuff. But there's actually a lot of animals in that site. It doesn't look like they were really that starving. So I was wondering, maybe this could be an instance where we see the role perhaps of children contributing to subsistence, which is very common in hunting gathering societies. The children learn how to do it on smaller game, where it doesn't really matter if they mess it up and, you know, get the butchering wrong or whatever. So in this instance, that could be something where we're seeing sort of the group active. And also other sites. This is Abric Romani again, big rock shelter. And because of the wonderful record there, the really fantastic preservation, this little circle here turned out to be basically a whole body of a wildcat that was the last thing that had been hunted just before they left during that phase. And hunted, butchered, probably eaten, but also the toes and the tailbones are missing. So it looks like they took the skin off with them and then took that wherever they were going afterwards. So you get these wonderful hints of sort of the systematicness of what they're up to. And again, with Abric Romani, when I was showing you the differences between those two layers, PA and PB, in the spatial patterns, you know, where the stuff is in the site. If you then look at what's going on with the animals that they're hunting between those two phases, we can see differences. One phase, they're going for red deer. The other phase, they're going for horses. So you start to be able to pull out possibilities where Neanderthals may be returning to places on a seasonal basis, which has, you know, been something that we've thought maybe was happening, but to actually be able to see potential data for that is really exciting. And there's going to be more and more work coming out on this. And I can't go into the detail of this too much, but we mustn't forget plants. There is so much more evidence now than there ever used to be for Neanderthals understanding, just as much they did with animals, that plants were a really important resource. And as you would expect, in environments where there's more plants, they use them more. You know, during the colder periods in the steppe tundra, it's less clear, but during the warmer periods and in the Near East where they lived, where it's, you know, never super, super cold, we can see more of it. So the overall picture with how they sort of were living and subsisting is basically that there's this impression of selection and choice there, that they're not just sort of randomly taking what's around, they take the best of what is around in their environments. We can see differences in sort of the location of where they do things. So we have kill sites where they're actually hunting, and then we can see in some instances that they partially process the carcasses there, take them to another place for secondary processing, get some marrow out, smash the bones up a lot more, and then they'll take the remains of that, the good stuff, further, presumably to others waiting in another place, perhaps, maybe a big site like Abric Romani. So all these ideas about sort of Neanderthals as, I guess, not really thinking about what they're doing, those are really things we need to move away from. And we, as archaeologists, that certainly is the case. So I said earlier that I'm sort of quite keen on stone tools. I'm not actually going to go into huge depth in stone tools here because there's too much other things to talk about. But this notion of quality and skill that we see in how they hunt, it's absolutely also reflected in what they're doing with their technologies. And this image is from the book. I worked with a wonderful illustrator who was also an archaeologist, Alison Atkin, and we wanted to communicate the idea that Neanderthals sometimes, in some of their technologies, it's almost like production line efficiency in what they're doing. So, I mean, if you sort of know anything about the Paleolithic or not, it doesn't really matter. But one of the key concepts of the technological sort of stage that Neanderthals are associated with, which is the Middle Paleolithic, is not just having sort of hand axes, so two-sided objects that you shape, but also that flakes themselves become really important, and ways to make flakes in many different forms, but also resharpening those flakes, maintaining those flakes. A shift that's happened over several decades is that we pay slightly less attention now than we used to the shape of sort of a retouched scraper, for example, because we've kind of realized that the Neanderthals are not paying much attention to that, and that the shape is actually just because they've resharpened it and they've held on to it for a long time. So that's a shift from typology, what things look like, to technology, the process of how they were used. So, and these are bone shards that are retouchers, basically. They're the things that they use to sharpen the tools. And these become really clearly important through the history of Neanderthals themselves. What they were doing with their stone is, again, really, really varied. They didn't just have one way of dealing with their material. We can see all different kinds. So this is one sort of what we call techno-complex, known as Le Valois, named after a suburb of Paris. But really the idea behind all of these, this is Le Valois, Kina, is that Neanderthals are focused on producing different kinds of flake products with different properties. Some of them, like the Valois flakes or blades, because they absolutely could make blades, they give you a lot of cutting edge without being very heavy. So they're quite good to carry around the landscape. Kina is another kind of flake production system, which are really good for resharpening because they're very thick flakes. They can take a lot of different resharpening phases. So they're really good if you need to be very mobile. Then you have discoid, which is just named for sort of the rough shape of the cores, but that's undergone a revolution in how we understand that technology. It used to be regarded as a bit rubbish. Maybe you just did it on bad stone, but we understand it a lot better now. And it actually looks more like disposable tech. It's something that you do when actually you don't want to take that stone around and you just use it for the moment. But that doesn't mean it's not something that's systematically produced, because what makes discoid flakes really useful is that they are ergonomic. Every flake you take off that core comes with a ready-made surface for you to hold with your hand. It's blunted already. And every flake that comes off prepares the surface for the next flake you take off. So it's super efficient. So all of these different ideas with their technology, they all come towards these ideas about selection and choice. And we can even see, thanks to studies that combine refitting, so putting things back together with use wear, which is where we look at the distinctive polish on stone tools that tells us what they were used for. And when we combine those, we can sometimes see that there are sort of second generation systems where Neanderthals are taking the flakes that they made and then treating those like a little core and taking more things off. And the little pieces that come off are then systematically used for different things. But there's always this impression that they are really choosing what they do. And again, just as we see with them sort of separating where they are doing things in the landscape with hunting and processing of carcasses, we see exactly the same thing with stone tools. Everything is fragmented in different places in the landscape. So they are active across very large scales. And also the materiality of the Neanderthal world is something that I really sort of delve into a lot in the book, because there's so much complexity there. which has really significant implications for cognition and understanding how they saw material potential. And so these are pieces of stone, and in some cases just individual pieces of birch tar, which is a glue that Neanderthals worked out how to make. You have to cook it out of birch bark. And we found it in multiple different places. Probably over, if it wasn't reinvented, then it's a technology that's lasting more than 100,000 years. That's interesting in itself, but what it also shows us is that they knew about how to, or they could conceptualize composite tools, that is, pieces made from more than one part that you stick together. And that's very complex in terms of, understanding how to do that, the different stages. And we also have example from Italy, which may be a mix of pine resin and beeswax, which is, another layer of complexity there. So I've kind of talked about some of their material engagements already, what they're doing with stone. It's impressive, but we see it reflected in other things. So they take their know-how with stone and they apply it to shell in some places in Italy and Greece, but not in Iberia, interestingly, although the same shell species are around, shellfish. We can see that, contrary to what used to be believed, in some places Neanderthals were interested in using bones as tools. These are probably skin working tools. Wood as well, and plants. They weren't only eating them, they understood the potential of these things as parts of their technology as well. So we have spears. This is a spear around 330,000 years old. This is just, sticking out of the section in the excavation here. But it's one of, I think, 8 or 9 spears, which are very likely for throwing, because we can see the way that they have been weighted is very much like javelins, basically. The knowledge and the craftsmanship in those tools is really evident, not only in the shaping, but for example, it looks as if with these and also with other wooden tools, because we have digging sticks from Italian and Spanish sites, we can see that they offset the carvings away from the grain of the wood, which is probably because it will mean that it's less likely to split. So they really are understanding their properties. So overall, sort of the material world is really diverse. But everybody, stone tools and everything, it's interesting, but people also want to know with Neanderthals, was there something beyond just everyday survival? Were they interested in something that went beyond functionality and into, realms that we might think of that relate to art? And this is where it gets complicated. And I have tried very hard in the book to sort of weigh the evidence up and to approach it from this idea about what they knew about materials and what they were interested in, rather than what we necessarily are interested in. And this is a good example. So this is a scraper, a tool from a French site, Après-Merveille, which is made of rock crystal. And it looks beautiful to us. It's a stunning object, but it doesn't seem to have been actually treated differently to any of the other stone in that site. It's just a rock that flakes nicely, so they used it. But in other cases, it's not so clear what's going on. This is a new site, or not new site, but a newly published paper from an Italian site, Grotta Fermane, where amongst the objects, there are a number of very flat, very similarly shaped pebbles, which have been selected. They all seem to have been used for similar things like retouching specific materials. But are they selecting them for the color as well? Potentially, but potentially not. And we have to be really careful. And I really like this paper because they go and look at the source of where the Neanderthals were probably getting this stuff from. They look, how easy is it to find these pebbles? Do they stand out? Well, they kind of do. It's not really possible to say for sure if they are selecting them for their color or just because they are the perfect shape and material for what they want to do with them. But as we'll see, there is evidence that makes us think that the color of those tools could actually have been part of the reason that they were selected. And that's the fact that over the past few decades, there's been a really broad sort of coalescence of more and more evidence from different places that Neanderthals did maybe have an emerging aesthetic sensibility, an emerging interest in the aesthetics of materials. And this includes pigments. So this is pigment from a site, and we find it's not everywhere, and it's not as sort of overwhelmingly present as it is in the upper Paleolithic. So after the Neanderthals, it's not as common, but the more we look for it, the more we see it. And it's not only there as lumps that have been used on to rub on things, but we can also see that it's used on unusual objects. So this is a shell from a Spanish site where there's a little bit of pigment there, but it's a pigment mix. It's made of more than one color, and those two pigment sources are not from the same place in the landscape. So it's an intentional mixing, presumably to get a different color and to be applied onto a surface. Now, this shell might have been food waste, but this one was not. This is from the same site as those green pebbles, Grotta Fermane, and this is a tiny little fossil shell that was collected from a geological outcrop, probably 100 kilometers away from Fermane. Presumably it was picked up because it was interesting and unusual. And on the outside, it has red pigment that comes from 40 kilometers in a different direction. So when you start to see these links between different aspects of unusual materials and they come together, it's quite persuasive that something's going on. Again, there's been a lot of interest in Neanderthal, maybe having sort of a focus on the claws of large raptors and collecting those. Not always easy to say why, but in one case so far, this is from Carapina, we have an eagle talon, which again has a mix of pigments on it. So that's kind of hard to explain as just a random thing. Then we have other objects as well. We've got a few things now where we have series of incisions which are not to do with butchery. This is the only sort of potential engraving on a rock surface. This is from the floor of a cave in Gibraltar. And it kind of brings us back to this again, because this object, this piece of pigment, also has scratches on which don't seem to be related to making powder. So there's all these different links between what they're doing. And a very recent find, which is a German site, a giant deer's toe bone, about 51,000 years old, I think this one is. And this would be pretty much the most complicated graphical engraving that we have for Neanderthals. It may not look like much, but when you examine the fact that you have these intersecting lines, and there's another series down here, that's quite complex. And when you put it together with the rest, it does appear something's going on. Then we have really strange sites. This is a French site, Brunequel, where we have a cave deep into a hill with huge rings of snapped off stalagmites formed into circles with little piles in between. We don't really know what is going on with this. They've been selected for their size. It's not an accident, and it's 174,000 years old. And as far as we know, that is Neanderthals. And this is important because the rings are impressive in themselves, but when you look deeper at the structure, you can see things have been piled up, and there's actually internal structure. Things have been balanced on top of each other. It was called, you know, in media reports, oh, it's the Neanderthal Stonehenge, which obviously is totally over the top, but it is something that's constructed, and we don't actually understand what's going on here. This is a site that's still being investigated. We don't know if people are living here. I don't think it makes much sense because it's so deep inside a hill, you'd need permanent light. So that's got more to tell us. There's a lot to say about death as well. I can't go into too much detail now because this is a overview talk, but suffice it to say that there is more going on than individual bodies being deposited. That's something that's been debated for Neanderthals for a long time. It's been really encouraging to see research teams going back to key sites. So, for example, this is La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, which was first excavated in 1909, a very key case. And a team went back recently to basically just re-examine the context of that. Was there really a pit? What can we say? And it turned out that maybe the pit was dug, maybe it wasn't, but the condition of the bones of the Neanderthal inside that feature had had a different burial history to the animal bones in the layers around them. So something is going on there. And this is a new site from Shanidar, well, not a new site, but a new individual with a really exciting context. So this is being looked at with all the modern technologies. But the other thing that's happening so much more beyond this notion of bodies going into the ground by themselves is the fact that bodies are also being processed, taken apart, sometimes eaten, sometimes also parts being taken and used as tools. Now, the idea of cannibalism often for us is a little bit like, oh, don't know about that. But actually, it's really normal. If you look through the archaeological record, through Neanderthals, after Neanderthals, later prehistory, it goes on all the time. And it's not always about something to do with defilement or, you know, negative context. It can also just be a means of what one does with the dead. And you still find it in ethnographic contexts. So I think we really need to consider that this might have been something that Neanderthals were also doing within their groups, and it was just part of normal behavior. And in some instances, we see hints, again, that maybe something else is going on, where we have pieces, for example, this is a little piece from the top of a skull from French site, which has been used as a retoucher, one of those things I was saying which you just sharpen your stone tools with. But it's actually a really bad choice for doing that. It's not the right shape, it's too thin. It's been used kind of despite its unsuitability. And out of all the sites, well, according to the paper that this came from, it's the only piece of skull that we have used as a retoucher from any species. So something else is going on there. This is one skull from a site where we have a lot of different processed Neanderthal remains from Krapina. On the top of the skull, there's a series of more than 30 very small incisions, nothing to do with butchery, as far as we can see, something else. But what unites these two things is that they're both skulls, they're both heads. And really cool paper that really recently came out looked at the reactions of chimpanzees, two skulls of different species, and they absolutely focused on the skulls of their own species. They can recognize that as a face, even though, you know, it's just a skull. And for us, certainly, the site and the center of our social relations is the face and the body. So maybe this is something important to Neanderthals in how they dealt with their dead. I haven't got much time left, so we're coming to the end of the Neanderthal story now. You know, what happened to them? Such a complicated topic. You know, it has been and remains highly debated. What I will say is that there is a lot of flux and change in how we think about this. And some of the questions have changed a lot. One is that we know early Homo sapiens people were in Eurasia way earlier than we used to think. We used to sort of think they turned up around maybe 40,000 years ago and then the Neanderthals are gone. That really is not where we are now. We can see that they are entering at least the Near East, maybe 180,000 years ago. They're right across into Australia by 65,000 years ago. So there is a much longer period of possibility for co-presence and interactions. And we certainly see it genetically, and I'll say that in a minute. But the sort of, there have always been claims for cultures that maybe reflected contact, but the archaeological context of those in some cases is not great. They were dug some time ago. There may be mixing. So modern research is really focusing at trying to unpick that. When we get clean layers from modern sites, can we still see this mixed character to the archaeology? And in some cases, the answer is no. So this is very interesting. And there's so much nuance now about the discussion around why they disappeared. But this is another image from the book just showing the DNA. And even since I published the book, you know, there's new cases here of interbreeding. So these little stars, this is early Homo sapiens. These are cases where we can see in fossil individuals from 40,000 years old plus, where there definitely were Neanderthal ancestors in their lineage. In some cases, here, this individual had a Neanderthal ancestor 200 years before they lived, incredibly close in time. They lived probably around 40,000 years ago. So that's very close to when Neanderthals disappeared. So interbreeding is still happening really late, but it's also happening early. So there's a long history of it. But, you know, I like to think, did this person know that they had the Neanderthal ancestor? Because, you know, 200 years doesn't sound a lot, but that's actually a lot of different ancestors over 2 to 4 generations. So there's many questions about this. And just to sort of wrap it up, I've said a lot about how our vision of Neanderthals has changed, and, you know, that the differences between early Homo sapiens people and Neanderthals have really shrunk in many ways, but there do remain differences. There is still a gap in terms of what we can see archaeologically. So what are the differences that may pertain to their disappearance? One is, to come back to burial, although Neanderthals are doing a lot of interesting stuff, they're not doing as much stuff as we can see in some of the early Homo sapiens records. So this is a lovely new find from Kenya of a young child, probably wrapped in some kind of maybe fabric or, you know, plants or something, but a body that was placed carefully and with really clever taphonomic analysis. It looks like the head was resting on some kind of pad maybe, and that's why it's sort of sticking up over time. It's changed its angle. This is 78,000 years old from Africa. This is in the Near East, and this is a site called Kafse, where it's probably 90,000, 100,000, 100,000 plus. This is a double burial. We have nothing like this from Neanderthals. We've got no instances where there's 2 individuals clearly together. This is an adolescent or a sort of young adult, probable male, and a child about 6, probably placed in the same context. And then we got nothing like this. So this is a much later Upper Paleolithic individual, but just to make the point of, in some cases, we have graves with so much stuff in there, you know, thousands of beads. We don't have anything like that for Neanderthals. There's no clear context where something's been put in there that is totally clearly special or unusual. The best we've got is a site from the Near East where there's a less broken deer jaw on the body compared to all the other animal bones, which are much more broken in the site. So there's a hint, but it's not that impressive. Then we look at, you know, all of the different aspects of art and symbolic behavior that we can see in early Homo sapiens people. Neanderthals had shell with pigment on. They didn't have sites where we find loads of them. And this is 145,000 years old from North Africa. So it's, you know, I don't think from Neanderthal context we have any clearly pierced teeth or bones. We don't see any carved representations like this. This is from more than 40,000 years ago in Germany. This is all early Homo sapiens made. And now the earliest painted sites that we have are from Indonesia, more than 45,000 years old. And again, Neanderthals are doing things with pigment, but they're not drawing things like this that we can see. So, you know, and again, this is all more stuff from South Africa, just to make the point that giant deer toe bone with the sort of cross-hatch engravings. It's interesting, but then you've got sites where there's loads of it in South Africa. So they're just doing more of it. It's like a hyped up version of what Neanderthals seem to be doing, but there's more. Technologically, there may be differences that could relate to what's happening with why Neanderthals may be disappearing if these early Homo sapiens people are exiting Africa with better hunting technology. We can see now that lightweight spears, probably, or darts, and maybe bow and arrows have already been developed in Africa 80,000 years ago. Now, we don't see that clearly for Neanderthals, and this is the kind of technology that we see in the Near East that's coming out with this last pulse of Homo sapiens in that last 10,000 years before Neanderthals disappear. There have been claims for Neanderthals making some cave art, but it's been critiqued. For me, I think that's still ongoing. There's work in one of the sites trying to tie pigment in the Neanderthal layers to these paintings on the walls, which have been dated to more than 45,000 years old. But again, I think the jury's out on this. Could it be Homo sapiens earlier than we think? Well, that's one possibility. Now, there was a new paper very recently that came out that suggests that a site in southeast France, Grotte Mandrin, which always had a very odd looking layer with sort of tiny little points which would fit with bow and arrow or very lightweight spears. Doesn't look like stuff Neanderthals made, but that was 15,000 years older than any Homo sapiens we knew about in southeast France. And there's now been a claim that there is a tooth from this layer which is a Homo sapiens tooth. So that's very interesting. There's some of the objects with it. It's got a worked eagle talon, which Neanderthals did do, but there's also bone working and shaping of a tooth, which is not really what they did. And this odd looking stone tools, they match the stuff that we see in the Near East that we are certain is Homo sapiens. So that's interesting. And you know, this layer that sticks out at that site as having this very early presence of Homo sapiens in France, that's interesting, but also it's interesting for the fact that it's one layer. They don't seem to be there long. And then you've got 15,000 years where Neanderthals come back. So the idea that as soon as Homo sapiens entered a region and Neanderthals immediately have to be extinct and are overcome or outcompeted, that's not what this site is suggesting. It tells us that the narrative of what was going on in those last 15,000 years was way more complicated than we used to think. So just to finish, you know, who were the last Neanderthals after these periods of interbreeding? We know there was a lot. What's the social context for that interbreeding? We don't really know. Was there mixing of cultures? Again, it's very hard to say. I think we should assume, given the huge breadth of their world, that lots of different processes are happening in different places, and the picture is not going to be the same everywhere. Some places we might be looking at conflict, some places we might be looking at curiosity and amicable relations. So this really is where I want to leave the talk. You know, talked a lot about what we could see archaeologically, modern ideas about how Neanderthals lived, and disrupting narratives about what happened to them. And really, one of the things I like to always leave talks with is the absolute revolution, not only in the archaeology, but in the reconstruction art that we have about Neanderthals. How are we actually envisioning them? And what we can really see now is that Neanderthals are able to look confident, they look happy, they look, you know, like they are interesting people and people who were curious about the world. So I think this modern vision of Neanderthals so well represents what we see archaeologically. So thank you.
A few questions from the room and then some questions from online. So if I hand over this microphone, if you hold up your hands, we'll get around the room and try and get your questions.
Could you say a little bit about any Neanderthal remains or sites in this country, please?
Yeah, the answer is we do have some. If you would like to go to a site, or several sites up in Derbyshire, Cresswell Crags is a gorge with lots of caves. We don't have as much as many sites in France. You know, you can have a layer in one French site with 20,000 objects. That's like 10 times more than what I studied for my PhD. But I think what's interesting about this, about the British context, is that we have a very early Neanderthal occupation, and then they're not here for a long time. And that might be because during that really warm period I was talking about, around 120,000 years ago, it looks like sea levels may have risen really fast, and some of the animals got across, but not the Neanderthals. So there's a big gap. And then there's a late occupation that we can look at. And technologically, the later occupation is kind of similar in many ways to what's going on in sort of on the continent. So, because it was connected at the time. So I think it's interesting because it kind of has its own differences, but in terms of the richness of what we can say, unfortunately, there's not a lot. Many sites suffered early excavation and there's not a lot left. But yeah, we have some modern sites and they can be quite interesting as well. Linford is one from Norfolk.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for a really brilliant lecture, and particularly the fact that you have such a sort of humane approach to this, which I think is so important, because all of us here have, as I understand, some DNA from the Neanderthals anyway.
Yes.
So, and it's about that I want to ask a question. I wonder if there's been any sort of demographic surveys to determine whether there are populations where there are significantly more or significantly less Neanderthal DNA in current populations, whether you find that in some part of Asia people have a lot more Neanderthal and in other parts not.
Well, I will have to say I'm not a genetic specialist, so and for those of us who are archaeologists, we're always keeping up with it because it's very fast moving. But essentially, everybody who's alive does have some Neanderthal DNA. People who have sub-Saharan African backgrounds have a lot less, very small percentages. And theirs is probably gained through later context, well after the Neanderthals vanished, contact with Eurasians much later. So it's kind of like secondhand in a way. Whereas Eurasian people, depending on sort of the sample you look at and how you look at it, in some contexts, it looks as if maybe East Asians have slightly more than, for example, Europeans. That might be reflecting more phases of interbreeding that happened in early Homo sapiens populations that moved through and then were in East Asia, and they have more genetic legacies in those living populations. Whereas for living European, people from European backgrounds, a lot of those populations actually have nothing to do with the Pleistocene people that were living there. It's largely Neolithic, sort of from later movements in with some Mesolithic. So sort of the short answer is that there is a global difference, but we're still picking out the sort of precise percentages in sort of Eurasians as a whole. And what does that actually mean? Does it reflect different histories of contact and things like this? Or does it actually reflect much later replacements of Homo sapiens by Homo sapiens over the millennia after Neanderthals had already vanished? Hope that answers you.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks very much. In the slides which you showed earlier and also later on, it's quite clear that, as you stated, that the rib cage is much wider. Why? And what advantages would it have?
Well, I think with Neanderthals and other hominins, actually, we always have to be a bit careful because we're always looking for adaptive explanations. And in some cases, you can have physical differences that are just neutral. They don't affect survival and they just continue. So not everything has to have an explanation. But in terms of the ribs and other features, for example, the large nose, the thinking over that has changed. And it may be, it used to be thought maybe that the large nose and maybe larger lungs was to do with them living in cold climates and kind of needing to warm air up through their membranes before it got into the body. But that kind of has shifted now, and it looks maybe that it's actually to do with metabolism, and just that sucking in lots and lots of oxygen is what you need if you have a high metabolism, really intensive lifestyle. So big lung capacity may be to do with just the fact that how they're built, they're more massively built, they have a higher calorific need because they are more massive, and they're living really intensive lifestyles. We can see from the muscle markings on their bones that they are just massively active, super, super fit, just, constantly moving around probably and carrying heavy loads as well. And you've got to fuel that. And it's okay eating a lot of food, but then you need oxygen to process that. So it's probably to do with lifestyle. Maybe there's also some climate in the mix, but it's not just about climate.
Okay, thank you.
Given the slightly larger body mass of Neanderthals with the interbreeding, might a Neanderthal female giving birth to a Homo sapien child likely be more successful than the other way around? Is there any research into this?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that what we can see about the shape of the birth canal is that it looks like Neanderthals didn't have to have the same like twist that we do when we give birth. Like the baby has to twist itself as it goes through the birth canal, which is, you know, why sometimes we have a lot of issues. But it still was a tight fit for them. You know, they still had large skulls. So I don't know. It's a very good question, and I know that people are active at the moment in, you know, looking again at sort of issues around pelvic anatomy and things. So I would like to know the answer myself. Good question.
First of all, they say thank you for the talk. Could you say anything about their use of marine resources?
Yes, I think absolutely we know that Neanderthals were living in coastal sites. I mean, it's a little bit complicated because we have the sea level changing, but where we can see, for example, that the sea was always relatively close, no matter the climatic context, where you have very steep coastal shelves. Neanderthals were definitely able to forage and make good use of those resources. So we have some locales, for example, where they're foraging a lot for mussels, and they knew the trick of putting mussels in a fire to make them open. You know, so they're quite comfortable, I think, on the shoreline. There have been some claims that some of the fish species and crabs and things that you find in some sites means that they were diving. I'm not sure that that necessarily stands up, because depending on the tides, you can get those species at super low tide just by wading and getting into big rock pools and stuff. So I'm not really sure that they were necessarily diving and stuff like that. But not only the species sort of, you know, littoral species, but also stuff that was washed up. We have some cases where they're butchering dolphins and things like this. So they were perfectly at ease on the shore, I think, and were making the most of that area as well.
This next one says, might the markings on the skull be connected to mathematics?
Well, it's possible. I mean, not only for Neanderthals, but for early Homo sapiens context, where we see these, you know, series of incisions. One of the potential explanations for that is a kind of notation, maybe a means of noting amounts, perhaps not events, because in some cases we're able, I'm not sure with the skull, but in other cases of markers on the bones by Neanderthals, it looks as if they were made by the same tool, potentially in one go or maybe in two goes. So it may not be like a calendar that's kept over a long period, but it might be some kind of tally system. You know, like we all have like an innate ability to kind of just know that you see 5 and you know it's kind of 5. But counting beyond that is, you know, a more advanced thing cognitively. But the way that you might bridge that gap is with tally systems and using the fact that, for example, you know, your brain interacting with motor actions, doing things and interacting with materials is a very good way to remember things. It has an impact with memory. So it's one possibility. And
the last one online is, how do you tell the difference between the hearths left by Homo sapiens and those of Neanderthals?
Hearths,
sorry,
yeah.
I'm having a moment.
There's very little difference, I think I would say. For most of the time, early Homo sapiens people have very simple campfire-like hearths as well. You only really see strongly sort of spatially set hearths with like a lot of stones around them, quite a long time after Neanderthals have gone, sort of 30,000 years, I think. So for most of the time, there's not very much difference. There may be some difference might emerge if you looked for things like the consistent placement through time in one part of the cave. Neanderthals sometimes do seem to do that, but perhaps not as much. So I think maybe that would be where I would look for differences.
We've really reached the end of our session. So if there's any more questions, perhaps hang back at the end and talk to Rebecca? You
Yeah,
to hang on
sure.
a little bit longer. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to bring this lecture to a close. Remind everyone that our next lunchtime lecture is on Tuesday, the 3rd of May at 1 o'clock. It's entitled Stonehenge and the British Empire, an Overlooked Debt by Mike Pitts, FSA. This event will take place in person and online. Please look at our website if you wish to book. It's free to anyone to join, and I'd also encourage you, if you haven't, to sign up to SAL on our website. And finally, to thank Rebecca for her fantastic lecture.
Thank you.